She had been sitting on that bench for 3 days. Not sleeping, not eating, barely moving, just sitting with her spine curved against the cold stone, her arms wrapped tight around a worn canvas bag as though it held something worth protecting. The rain had soaked through her jacket hours ago, and her sneakers, white once, maybe, in another season, were split along the left sole, letting the puddle water seep in with every shift of her weight. People passed her on the way in and out of the hospital entrance. Some glanced down. Most didn't bother. A nurse had asked her once if she needed help. Elena had said no. A security guard had told her twice to move along, that the bench was not a shelter. Elena had nodded, walked to the edge of the parking lot, waited until he went back inside, and returned to the same spot. She had nowhere else to be. She had one thing left to do in the world, and she could not do it from anywhere other than right here. In her jacket pocket was a folded piece of paper, soft at the creases from being opened and refolded so many times the ink had started to blur. Her mother had pressed it into her hand the morning they took her by ambulance, not gently, not the way a sick woman touches her daughter, but with the grip of someone who needed to be certain the message got through. "Find him," her mother had said. "Before it's too late. Find Adrien Cole." Elena had looked at the name, looked at her mother's face, and understood that whatever came before this moment, all the years of silence, all the things her mother had never explained, had been leading here. She had written the name in careful letters on a fresh sheet of paper anyway, just so she would not lose it. She had not lost it. She had been sitting outside Hargrove Memorial Hospital for 71 hours, with that paper in her pocket, waiting for a man she had never met, watching every dark car that turned through the gate. Elena was 21 years old. She had grown up in a 2-room apartment on the east side of the city, where the radiator knocked all winter, and the landlord never came when called. Her mother, Margaret, had worked reception jobs, filing jobs, cleaning jobs, whatever came available, whatever paid on time. Elena had learned early not to ask for things that cost money, and not to cry about the things she could not have. She had learned to make meals from what was left at the end of the week, and to wear the same shoes 2 school years in a row. She was not resentful about any of it. She had simply grown up understanding that their life operated on a different set of rules than the lives she saw on television. And she had built herself around that understanding with a quiet, practical kind of strength that people who knew her well found remarkable, and people who didn't know her well mistook for coldness. She worked 2 jobs: mornings at a diner on Haverford Street, evenings folding laundry at a dry cleaner 3 blocks from home. She sent money to her mother's account every Friday. She had been doing it since she was 17. Margaret had collapsed in their kitchen 4 weeks ago. The paramedics said it was her heart, a condition she had apparently been managing, or failing to manage, for years without telling her daughter. The ambulance brought her to Hargrove Memorial because it was the closest facility. The doctors there were capable, or said they were. The problem was the bill. The surgery Margaret needed was not an emergency surgery in the way that obligated the hospital to proceed regardless of payment. It was the kind of surgery that could be scheduled, postponed, reconsidered. It was the kind of surgery that required a deposit Elena could not produce in 10 lifetimes of diner shifts. She had tried everything she knew how to try. She had called every number on the financial assistance forms. She had filled out the paperwork twice and been told both times that her mother's case did not qualify under the current criteria. A caseworker with tired eyes had told her, not unkindly, that if the balance was not addressed within the week, Margaret would be transferred to a public facility across the city, where the wait list for her procedure was 14 months long. Elena knew, and the caseworker knew, and probably everyone on the floor knew, that Margaret did not have 14 months. She might not have 14 days. That was when Margaret had taken her daughter's hand and told her about Adrien Cole. Not everything. She was too weak for everything, but enough. A name. A company. "He'll remember me," Margaret had said. "Tell him my name. He'll know." Elena had not asked the questions that were pressing at the back of her mind, because her mother's hand was shaking, and the monitor beside the bed was beeping in a way that made the nurse come in and adjust something. She had just memorized the name, written it down, kissed her mother's forehead, and gone outside to wait. and she had been waiting ever since, through a thunderstorm on the first night, through a morning when a woman from the cafeteria brought her a cup of soup she hadn't asked for, and she'd had to blink very hard to keep from crying, through 2 more visits from the security guard, whose name tag said Ramon and who had, by the 3rd day, stopped asking her to leave and simply nodded at her when he passed. She had a name. She had a piece of paper. She had nowhere else to go. On the evening of the 3rd day, a motorcade of black vehicles turned through the hospital gate. Not ambulances, these were sleek, long-bodied sedans, moving in the coordinated way that meant someone important was inside. Elena stood up from the bench before she knew she was standing. The lead car pulled forward, and she could see, mounted in the lower corner of the rear window, a small silver emblem she recognized because she had looked it up on the library computer the morning after her mother told her. A stylized letter C inside a clean geometric frame. The logo of the Cole Group. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the folded paper, and she began to walk toward the cars before they had fully stopped. Adrien Cole was 44 years old and had not, in recent memory, done anything without a reason. He moved through the world with the particular economy of a person whose time had been precious for so long that the habit of efficiency had become indistinguishable from personality. He was not a cold man. Exactly, the people who worked closely with him would have said something more nuanced than that, but he was contained, and he had been contained for a long time, and the containment had over the years taken on the quality of something structural rather than chosen, like load-bearing walls. He wore it the way he wore everything, without apparent effort, without apology. He had come to Hargrove Memorial that evening to visit a business partner who had been admitted 2 days earlier following a mild cardiac episode. A courtesy call, the kind of thing his assistant had initially offered to handle and Adrien had decided to do himself, partly out of genuine regard for the man, and partly because he had found, since his wife's death 3 years ago, that movement was easier than stillness, and hospitals at least gave him somewhere specific to be. He stepped out of the car and straightened his jacket. And his lead security man, a former federal agent named Douglas, moved smoothly into position at his right. The hospital entrance was lit in the way hospital entrances always were, aggressively, as though the fluorescence itself might ward off whatever had brought people there. Adrien was looking toward the door when something moved in his peripheral vision, a figure coming toward the motorcade at a pace that was not quite running but was fast enough to make Douglas step forward. A young woman, dark-haired, thin, wearing a jacket that was soaked through. She had the look of someone who had been outside for a very long time and had decided that being outside for any longer was not an option she would accept. Douglas put a hand out, palm flat. "Ma'am, please step back." 2 of the other security detail had already moved to flank her, not aggressively, but with the solid, practiced presence that communicated clearly. "This is not happening." Elena stopped. She was breathing hard, not from exertion but from the effort of holding herself together in front of a man she had never met, whose entire bearing communicated that he was not accustomed to being stopped on sidewalks. She looked past Douglas directly at Adrien Cole. "Mr. Cole," she said. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "My name is Elena. My mother is Margaret Voss. She's inside this hospital and she's dying, and she asked me to find you." Nothing happened for a moment. Adrien was looking at her with the careful, evaluative attention of a man who had been approached by strangers with stories before. Douglas was still holding his arm out. The car engines idled. Then Elena said the name again, her mother's name, and something shifted in Adrien Cole's face. It was not large. It was not the kind of thing a stranger would catch. It was the micro-movement of a man who has just heard something that he had, without knowing it, been waiting to hear for a very long time, or perhaps dreading, which is sometimes the same thing. He was still for 2 full seconds. Then he said, quietly, to Douglas, "It's fine." Douglas lowered his arm. The other 2 agents held their positions, but stopped pressing forward. Adrien looked at Elena, really looked at her, the way he hadn't bothered to for the first few seconds. And she watched him take in the wet jacket, the ruined shoes, the bag she was holding in front of her like a shield, and the expression on her face that was not pleading but was something more difficult to dismiss than pleading. It was the expression of someone who has already spent everything they have and is asking for nothing she doesn't need. "How long have you been here?" he asked. She didn't pause. 3 days. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "What do you want from me?" She looked at him directly and said, "I want you to go upstairs and let my mother tell you something before she can't anymore." It was not what he had expected. He had expected money, a request for payment, an appeal to his foundation, some version of the transaction he was approached for regularly. The specificity of what she'd said, not "give me something," but here something pulled at a thread he hadn't known was loose. He checked his watch. He had a meeting in 2 hours. His partner was on the 3rd floor waiting for him. He had 47 things on his schedule for the next 3 days that could not easily be rearranged. 5 minutes, he said. He said it quietly, not to Elena but more or less to himself, as though giving himself permission. Then he looked back at her. "Show me which room." They rode the elevator in silence, Douglas a careful distance behind. Elena stood with her hands pressed flat against the sides of her bag and did not try to fill the quiet. Adrien watched the floor numbers climb and thought about the name. Margaret Voss. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in 20 years. He had thought about it, in the way you sometimes think about the things you've left unexamined at odd hours, on sleepless nights, in the compressed wakefulness before a difficult meeting. But hearing it spoken in the open air, in the voice of a young woman who clearly had no idea what weight she was carrying, was different. The elevator opened on the 6th floor, and Elena led him down a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and something warmer and sadder beneath it, and stopped outside room 614, and pushed the door open slowly, and stood aside. The woman in the bed was smaller than memory. That was the first thing Adrien registered, how illness had reduced her, how the figure he remembered as capable and composed, and carrying always the particular authority of someone who moved through a busy office with quiet competence, had become this diminished form, under a thin hospital blanket, with monitors charting the labor of her continued existence in green lines and soft beeps. Margaret Voss had been his personal secretary for 6 years, from the time he was 24 and building the Cole Group from a single real estate venture into something more serious, until the day she had walked out of the company and out of his life without explanation, leaving behind only a brief, formal resignation letter and a desk cleared of everything personal. He had not known, for 20 years, what had happened to her. He had not, he realized now, tried very hard to find out. She opened her eyes when Elena touched her hand. Her gaze moved from her daughter to the man standing in the doorway, and something passed across her face recognition, and something else beneath it that might have been relief. "Adrien," she said. Her voice was thin but clear. He came to the side of the bed and sat in the chair Elena had been using for 4 weeks and did not say anything for a moment. Because he was looking at her and understanding, the way you sometimes understand things you have known for a long time without allowing yourself to know them. That he had made a serious mistake. "Margaret," he said. "I'm sorry it took this long." She shook her head slightly. "I didn't make it easy." She paused to breathe. "I need to tell you something. I've been carrying it long enough." Elena stood at the foot of the bed. She had heard pieces of this story. Her mother had mentioned the Cole Group twice in her life, both times briefly, both times with an expression Elena hadn't been old enough to read. She understood that something had happened between these two people, something that had not ended cleanly. But she didn't know the details, and she had never pushed. She stood now and listened as her mother, in a voice that grew stronger and then weaker, and then stronger again with the effort, told it. 20 years ago, near the end of her time at the Cole Group, several critical documents had gone missing from the company's internal archives, documents related to a major acquisition, the kind of thing that could shift the outcome of a negotiation significantly if they ended up in a competitor's hands. The loss had been discovered during an audit. The internal investigation had been brief. Someone had pointed to Margaret. She was the person with access. She was the person who had been alone in the records room on the relevant evening. She had been asked to resign before anyone had to be asked to fire her, and she had left because she was 29 years old and exhausted and did not have the resources to fight a corporate legal team, and because no one, not a single person she had worked alongside for 6 years, had stood up and said, "Wait, let's hear her side." Adrien was very still. Elena was watching him. He was looking at his hands. Margaret said, "I know you weren't the one who accused me. I know you were young and busy, and you believed what you were told. I'm not asking you to feel guilty about that." She stopped, breathed. "But I need to tell you who actually took those documents, because that person is still there. And I kept the proof." A silence fell over the room that had nothing to do with the hospital's careful quiet. Elena looked at her mother, and then at Adrien, and then back at her mother, and she understood that the thing she had been sent to accomplish, this simple act of finding a name and delivering it to its owner, was not the end of something but the beginning of something much larger and more complicated than she had imagined. Outside, the rain continued, and the city moved in its indifferent rhythm, and in room 614 of Hargrove Memorial, a 20-year silence finally broke. Before Margaret could finish, her eyes fluttered, and her breathing changed into something labored and irregular. The monitor spiked. Elena was already at the call button, and a nurse appeared within seconds, and the room shifted into the careful, controlled urgency of medical intervention. But not before Margaret reached under her pillow with a hand that trembled with the effort, and pressed something into Adrien's palm. An envelope, old, sealed, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges. She gripped his wrist for a moment with surprising force. "Don't let it disappear again," she said. The nurse was asking Adrien and Elena to step outside. They stepped outside. Elena stood in the corridor with her arms crossed over her chest, her back against the wall, her eyes on the closed door. Adrien stood beside her, holding the envelope, and said nothing. He opened it in the corridor, standing under the fluorescent light with Elena 3 feet away, pretending to look at the floor. Inside were photocopied documents, old ones, the kind printed on paper that had a slightly different texture from what was used now, in a font that belonged to an earlier decade. A series of internal memos, a transfer record, and at the bottom, a handwritten note in Margaret's careful script that laid out, in plain, factual sentences, what she had seen and what she had done and what had been done to her. The name at the center of it, the name written in Margaret's handwriting as the person who had actually removed those documents and arranged for them to reach a competitor, was one Adrien knew extremely well. He read it twice. He read it a third time to be sure he was reading it correctly. Then he folded the documents carefully back into the envelope and held it with both hands, very still, in the way of a person whose internal landscape has just undergone a rapid and irreversible rearrangement. The name was James Wren, currently Executive Vice President of Strategic Development at the Cole Group, present at every board meeting, copied on every significant communication, a person Adrien had promoted twice in the last decade, had defended in 2 separate internal complaints, and had trusted, without ever consciously deciding to trust, in the way you trust someone who has been in the room long enough. A person who had, 20 years ago, framed an innocent woman and watched her walk out of her career without a word, and had apparently been willing to do far worse since. Adrien stood in the hospital corridor and felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel, the cold, clarifying weight of having been wrong in a way that had cost someone else everything. Elena was watching him now, not attempting to read the documents but reading his face instead, because his face told her what she needed to know. Whatever was in that envelope mattered. She had known it would, or her mother would not have kept it for 20 years, would not have made Elena promise to find this man, would not have spent her fading energy on making sure it reached its destination. What she hadn't known, until this moment, was whether the man receiving it would do anything with it. She was watching now to see what kind of man he was. She had been watching since the parking lot. Adrien looked up from the envelope and met her eyes, and she saw in his expression something she hadn't expected from a person with his kind of money and his kind of power. Genuine, unguarded remorse. He didn't explain it. He just looked at her and said, "I'll take care of this." She said, "I believe you." She said it plainly, Without warmth she didn't feel, and without caution she didn't think was warranted. She just said it. Then she walked back to the nurse's station and asked about her mother's condition, because her mother was still dying and the hospital still wanted money she didn't have, and the moral weight of a 20-year injustice, however real, did not pay a medical bill. She had been at the counter for 4 minutes when the administrative assistant looked up from her computer with a slight expression of confusion and said that Mrs. Voss's account showed a payment had just been processed in full. Elena looked at the screen. She looked at the amount. She looked at the timestamp, which was 11 minutes ago. She said, carefully, "By whom?" The assistant said there was no name attached to the payment. It had come through the hospital's charitable giving portal, anonymously. Elena stood very still for a moment. Then she went back down the corridor toward the elevator and passed Adrien Cole walking in the opposite direction toward the exit, and he did not slow down or acknowledge what he had done, and she did not ask. But she looked at him as they passed, and he looked at her, and something was exchanged in that moment that did not require language. He told himself it was nothing. He was thorough by nature. He had taken on a situation, and he would see it through to its logical conclusion. That was all it was. The fact that he found himself asking Douglas for updates on the young woman's situation, which hospital floor her mother was on, whether the treatment had begun, whether there were further complications with the billing, was not sentiment. It was diligence. He was a detail-oriented person. He noticed things. He noticed, for instance, that Elena had not asked him for anything. He noticed that when his assistant contacted her on his behalf the following day to offer a direct transfer of funds for personal expenses, framed carefully, professionally, as compensation for an injustice his company had indirectly caused her family, she had declined. Politely, briefly, without explanation that could be construed as ingratitude. She had simply said that she wasn't in the habit of taking money she hadn't earned, and that if there was something specific she could do to help with whatever came next, she would prefer to earn it. It was not a response he had anticipated. It did not fit any of the categories of response he had developed over years of philanthropy and corporate dealing for people who needed things from him. It sat in his mind with the slightly uncomfortable quality of something that does not go where you expect it to go. He thought about it more than he meant to. He asked his assistant, perhaps more casually than was warranted, whether the Cole Foundation's hospital partnership program had any short-term administrative positions available. His assistant, who had worked for him for 8 years and was practiced at reading the space between his requests and their stated reasons, said that she would look into it. By the following afternoon, Elena had been offered a temporary position coordinating the Foundation's patient assistance intake program at Hargrove Memorial 3 days a week, a reasonable hourly rate, the kind of work that would let her remain close to her mother while doing something concrete and useful. She took it. She was good at it immediately. In the practical, no-ceremony way, she seemed to be good at most things: organized, precise, patient with paperwork, and with people who had run out of patience for paperwork themselves. Adrien did not visit the Foundation office often. When he did, he was quiet in the way powerful people are sometimes quiet in situations that have caught them slightly off balance. And Elena was consistently direct in the way that had become, he noticed, one of the more unusual things about his immediate environment. Most people in his orbit adjusted their behavior in his presence, softened positions, sharpened presentations, performed some version of themselves calibrated for the room. Elena did not perform. She spoke to him the way she spoke to the intake patients. Plainly, without apology, with a specific kind of attention that meant she was actually listening to what he said, rather than processing how to respond to it. It was strange. It was, he found, somewhat necessary. He was a widower. He had not said that word about himself since the first year after his wife Catherine's death had found that it had a way of collapsing entire conversations into a shape he didn't want to occupy. He had a daughter, Sophie, who was 9, and lived with him and her grandmother and an assortment of staff at the family residence in the north part of the city, and who was, in most ways, a remarkable child, and in some specific ways, the only person Adrien was consistently, reliably gentle with. He had not let anyone close since Catherine. He had not, until recently, particularly wanted to. He had a life that worked, in its large outlines. He did not experience it as a life with something missing, because he had arranged it carefully not to feel that way. But something was different in the weeks after the hospital. Something had been introduced into the careful arrangement that did not fit the existing design, and he was, against his own preference, finding it interesting. He did not know that 3 blocks from the hospital, on a night he spent at the office reviewing the Wren file with his legal team, a car with no plates had followed Elena home from her shift and parked across the street from her building for 40 minutes before leaving. He did not know until she told him, 2 days later, in the direct and unamplified way she had of delivering information she thought was relevant. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, but he saw the effort it took to say it that way, and he understood that the situation had just moved from a legal matter, requiring careful management, to something more immediate than that. The man who had taken those documents 20 years ago had built his current position on the architecture of a lie, and he was not prepared to watch that architecture come down. James Wren had spent a week since Margaret Voss's name appeared in the Cole Foundation's patient records. He had sources in multiple administrative departments. He had not gotten this far without having sources everywhere, constructing a response to a problem he had hoped was finally permanently buried. Margaret was supposed to be gone. She had gone, obligingly, 20 years ago, and had apparently spent those 20 years in a kind of quiet poverty that should have been sufficient to ensure she never surfaced. The fact that she had a daughter, and that the daughter had somehow found her way to Adrien Cole, and that an envelope had apparently changed hands in a hospital corridor, told him that sufficient had not been enough. Elena came home one evening to find her apartment door slightly ajar. Nothing obvious was missing. She didn't have obvious things to take, but her desk drawer had been gone through. The documents her mother had asked her to keep in the apartment were out of their folder, and a box she used to store old papers had been emptied and imprecisely restacked. She stood in the middle of her small apartment and was very cold for a moment in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Then she took photographs of everything, locked the door, sat on the floor with her back against the bed frame, and called a number she had been given in case of emergency. Adrien answered on the second ring. She described what she was looking at. He said nothing for a moment, and in that silence, she could hear the quality of his attention, focused, rapid, the kind of thinking that moved in straight lines toward conclusions. He said, "Don't touch anything else. I'm sending someone." He paused. "Pack a bag, whatever you need for a few days." She started to protest, and he said, quietly but without leaving room for debate, "Elena, just her name." She packed the bag. What she didn't know, and what Adrien had been piecing together over the preceding weeks with his legal team and a private investigator he trusted, was that the documents in Margaret's envelope were not the only evidence. The original theft 20 years ago had been part of a larger pattern. Wren had, over 2 decades, been systematically redirecting information, suppressing certain deals, and occasionally facilitating outcomes that cost the Cole Group money, while lining private accounts Adrien had not known existed. The number was not modest. It was the kind of number that, when Adrien's financial forensics team first presented it to him in a quiet conference room with the curtains drawn, made him sit very still for a long time and stare at the middle distance. It was also the kind of number that explained why Wren could not afford to let the envelope become public, and therefore why Elena was being followed, and therefore why the situation had become, as Adrien explained to her without raising his voice, genuinely dangerous. She took this information with the composure that had become, he recognized, one of the more consistent things about her. She did not catastrophize. She asked precise questions. She wanted to know what the next steps were, who was handling it, what she could do. When he told her he had already engaged the relevant authorities and that the process was moving, she nodded and said, "And my mother?" He told her that Margaret was in a secure room with security outside the door, that the hospital had been briefed on a need-to-know basis, that nothing was going to happen to her before the surgery. Elena absorbed this. Then she looked at him and said, with the specific tiredness of someone who has been afraid for a long time and is choosing not to be anymore, "I've been dealing with impossible things alone my whole life. I'm not sure I know how to do it with help." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, From now on, you don't have to figure that out. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise of the kind that comes with implications about the future. It was simply a fact, stated with the same economy he brought to all facts. But Elena heard it, and she believed it, and in the quiet of the safe house where Douglas had driven her that night, she sat on a stranger's couch and let herself, for the first time in 3 days, stop holding everything so tightly. She slept without dreaming for 10 hours. The first thing she did was call the hospital to check on her mother. They found Margaret in an empty supply room on the 4th floor, unconscious, at 2 in the morning. She had been moved there, the investigation later determined, by a contract orderly who had been in Ren's employ for 6 months, and whose access badge should not have allowed him onto the 6th floor at all. A failure of protocol that the hospital's security director would spend a great deal of time explaining to several parties in the weeks that followed. When Elena's phone rang at 2:14 with Douglas's number, she was already awake. She listened to what he said and did not speak for a moment. Then she said, with a flat, absolute certainty, "Where is she now?" Margaret had been found before any harm was done. She was back in her room, with a security team that was no longer hospital staff, but people Adrien had personally arranged. Her vitals were stable. She had not regained consciousness. Elena listened to all of this and then said, "I need to see her." Douglas said he would have a car there in 8 minutes. The car arrived in 6. Adrien was already at the hospital when Elena got there. He had not gone to bed. He had been in his own car for the past hour, on the phone with his head of security and his legal team, and once, briefly, with a federal contact he had spent a decade cultivating and called on very rarely. He met Elena in the corridor outside her mother's room, and he looked at her face, the set of it, the particular quality of fear beneath the composure, and he did not fill the moment with explanations or reassurances. He simply stood close enough that she knew he was there. After a moment, she said, "He moved her. He actually moved her." Not asking, just saying it. Processing it. Adrien said, "Yes." She said, "Because he knew it was over. Because he knew you had everything." He said, "Yes." She turned and looked at him directly. "Then why hasn't it stopped?" He held her gaze. "Because he hasn't been stopped yet," he said. "But he will be. Tonight." She looked at him for a long moment, and some of the flatness went out of her face. Not all of it, but some. She pushed open the door to her mother's room and went in. The drive to where Ren was had been running in parallel. His passport application had been flagged 3 hours earlier, a request for expedited processing that Adrien's contact had been watching for. The federal team moved at 4 in the morning, which is the hour that such things tend to happen, and Ren was detained at his residence without drama or resistance, the way very intelligent people are sometimes detained when they realize that the evidence has already arrived ahead of them. Elena did not learn this until later that morning. Sitting in the orange plastic chair by her mother's bed, watching the monitors chart the small, persistent fact of her mother's heartbeat. Her phone buzzed. She read the message. She put the phone down on the blanket and pressed her hands flat on her knees and stared at nothing for a while. Then she reached out and held her mother's hand and said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Okay." Before the sun was fully up, Margaret's eyes opened. She looked at the ceiling first, then at her daughter, and her face moved through confusion into clarity, into something that was unmistakably relief. She didn't speak for a long moment. Elena said, "He knows." That was enough. Margaret closed her eyes again, but this time not from illness, from the particular easing of a person who has been holding something for 20 years and has finally been allowed to put it down. Her blood pressure, the nurse noted, was the best it had been in weeks. The Cole Group's annual shareholder meeting was not scheduled for another 3 months. Adrien moved it. His communications team sent the revised notice on a Tuesday. By Thursday, every major business publication in the city had a notification on their calendar, because when Adrien Cole called a shareholder meeting with 6 weeks' notice instead of 3 months, the people who paid attention to such things paid attention. The boardroom on the 41st floor of Cole Group headquarters held, on the morning of the meeting, More people than it had been designed to hold comfortably: shareholders, legal representatives, 2 members of the company's advisory board, a handful of journalists admitted under specific conditions, and a row of people from the Federal Financial Crimes Unit who were there in an observational capacity that everyone present understood to mean something definitive. Adrien spoke without notes. He had been preparing what he was going to say for 6 weeks, but he had prepared it by living with it, not by writing it down. And when he stood at the head of the room and began to speak, it came out with the flat, factual weight of something that has been organized, not for performance, but for precision. He laid out the timeline. He named the account structures. He described the specific mechanism by which proprietary information had been sold 20 years ago, and the way that mechanism had evolved and been used again, in more sophisticated forms, over the decades since. He showed the forensic accounting. He showed Margaret's original documentation. He showed what his team had assembled in the months of quiet, careful investigation that had followed. He did not editorialize. He did not use the word betrayal, though everyone in the room understood that the word was present in every sentence. When he finished laying out the facts, he paused for a moment. And then he said, 20 years ago, a woman named Margaret Voss was falsely accused of a crime she did not commit. She was driven out of this company. She spent the following decades in circumstances that no person of her ability and character should ever have been forced into. She was not protected by the people around her. She was not protected by me. I was young and I was busy, and I believed what I was told. And those are explanations, not excuses. And I want to be clear about the difference. He paused again. Her daughter Elena has agreed to be here today. He looked toward the door, and Elena came in not dramatically, not with the studied entrance of someone performing a moment, but simply by walking through the door and standing near the front of the room, in a dark blue jacket that was the only new piece of clothing she had bought in months, and that she had bought for this specific purpose. Margaret Voss served this company with integrity for 6 years, Adrien said. Her name was wrongly taken from her. I am here today to give it back. The room was very quiet. What followed was procedural and thorough, and moved with the inexorable quality of things that have been properly prepared. Wren's employment was formally terminated in absentia. The financial remediation process was initiated. The board voted on several structural changes to internal oversight protocols that had been drafted in the preceding weeks. Through it all, Elena stood at the front of the room and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not triumph, exactly, but the particular, quiet completion of something that had been unfinished for her entire life. She had not known, until this morning, that her life had a shape. She had just been living it, doing what needed doing, carrying what needed carrying, standing here, in this room that smelled of expensive coffee and recirculated air, watching the institutional machinery of justice execute what her mother had needed it to execute for 2 decades. She understood that the shape had always been there. She had just been the one who had to walk it to its end. After the formal proceedings, in the corridor outside the boardroom, Adrien found her standing by the window. He came and stood beside her, and they both looked at the city below for a moment. Then he said, "Your father's name will be included in the full disclosure documents. The legal team has confirmed it." Elena had learned about her father only in the weeks since the investigation had widened, learned that Thomas Voss had been Adrien's earliest business partner and closest friend, and that he had died in an accident that was not, the evidence now strongly suggested, an accident. She had been 3 years old. She had no memory of him. She had spent her life in the footnote of a story she hadn't known she was inside. She said, "I know." Then, "Thank you." Adrien said, "I'm sorry it took this long." She turned to look at him, really look at him, the way she had in the hospital corridor on the first night, assessing, direct. She said, "You're here now." The surgery took 4 hours and 11 minutes. Elena knew the exact time because she sat in the waiting room for the entirety of it, with a paper cup of coffee she stopped tasting after the first sip, and a book she had opened to page 32 and not read a single word of. Adrien was there for the first 2 hours, before a necessary meeting pulled him away. He left Douglas behind, which Elena noticed without commenting on. She read the same paragraph on page 32 several times. A nurse came out at the 2-hour mark and said things were going well. Elena said thank you. She continued not reading. At 4 hours and 11 minutes, the surgeon came out in his scrubs and said the procedure had been successful, that Margaret was in recovery, that there was every reason to expect a full recuperation, and that someone from the nursing staff would come get her daughter in about 30 minutes. Elena put the book down. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment. Then she took out her phone and sent a message. Adrien read it in the back of his car on the way back from his meeting. He read it twice. It was 3 words. She came through. He sat with his phone in his hand for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular, and felt something give way inside him, in the specific, cautious way that things give way in people who have held them closed for a long time. He told his driver to turn around. Margaret spent 3 weeks in recovery at Hargrove Memorial, and then 2 more at a rehabilitation facility that Adrien arranged quietly and did not mention. Elena visited every day. She continued her work with the foundation, which was no longer temporary. The foundation director had asked her, with some directness, whether she would consider a permanent role, and she had said she would think about it and had thought about it for approximately 4 hours before saying yes. The work suited her. She was organized and precise, and she had a way with the patients, the ones who came in exhausted and frightened, and not knowing which form to fill out first, that was particular to people who have themselves been exhausted, frightened, and standing at unfamiliar counters. She did not perform warmth for them. She just understood, specifically, what they were carrying, and that understanding was worth more than warmth. Adrien's daughter Sophie met Elena for the first time at a Sunday afternoon at the Cole residence, that Adrien had arranged under the casual cover of a foundation planning meeting, which had fooled no one and been accepted by everyone as the arrangement it was. Sophie was 9 and direct, and had apparently inherited whatever quality in her father made him see through the surfaces of things. She had looked at Elena for about 45 seconds at that first meeting, and then said, "My dad says you're really good at fixing complicated problems." Elena had said that she tried to be. Sophie had said, "He needs someone who's good at that." Adrien, across the room, had put his coffee cup down very carefully and found something important to examine on the far wall. Elena had looked at Sophie's pacific attention she gave everyone and said, "I've noticed that about him." The evening they went back to the bench was a Thursday in November, when the air had the cold sharpness of a city settling into winter, and the hospital lights spilled gold onto the wet pavement outside the entrance. Adrien had suggested it, without a great deal of preamble. He had been giving her a ride home after a late evening at the foundation, and he had simply turned into the hospital's parking lane and stopped the car. Elena had looked at the bench, the same stone bench, the same position near the doors, the same angle from which she had watched 3 days' worth of cars and faces and indifferent pedestrians, and had not said anything. They walked to it and sat down. It was cold. Neither of them moved to go inside. After a while, he said, "I've been thinking about what you said in the corridor the first night." She turned to look at him. "Which thing?" He thought about it. "You said you were used to dealing with impossible things alone, that you didn't know how to do it with help." She didn't answer immediately. She was watching the entrance, the same automatic doors, sliding open and shut for the same parade of exhaustion and worry and occasional relief. He said, "I don't think you were actually asking for help that night you came here." She said, "No." He said, "What were you asking for?" She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about most things. "For someone to listen," she said finally. "Not to fix anything, just to hear what my mother needed to say." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about that." She looked at him. He said, "You came here with nothing. You sat on this bench in the rain for 3 days with a piece of paper and a name. You didn't ask me to save anyone. You asked me to listen." He paused. "I think that's what actually started all of it." She said, "Started what?" He turned to look at her, and his face had the open quality it only had in very specific circumstances when he was with Sophie, or when he was speaking about something he had decided to stop containing. He said, "Whatever this is." Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the hospital entrance, where the light was warm and constant, and people were moving in and out with their individual burdens and their individual hopes, and she felt the cold November air on her face, and the solid weight of the bench under her, and the particular, unfamiliar quality of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She was not the girl who had sat here 3 days in the rain anymore. She was not unrecognizable to that girl. She was not so changed that she would fail to know herself in a mirror, but she was different in the way that the completion of something changes the person who carried it. The secret was out. Her mother was alive. Her father's name was clear. The lie had been dismantled. Publicly. Finally. With the kind of thoroughness that did not leave room for it to reassemble. She had carried all of that here, to this bench, with a piece of paper and a name, and she had been 21 years old and afraid, and she had sat here anyway. She thought she deserved to feel something about that. She let herself. "I know what it is," she said quietly. He looked at her. She turned to meet his eyes. "I just think we should take it slowly." He looked at her for a moment, and then something passed across his face that was rare enough that she noticed it immediately, something close to amusement and warmth behind it, and something else that she filed away to think about later. He said, "I can do slowly." She said, "I know." They sat together on the bench as the city settled into night around them, and the hospital doors opened and closed, and the light stayed constant and warm, and somewhere above them in a room on the 6th floor, a woman who had been carrying a 20-year silence was sleeping soundly for the first time and longer than either of them knew. The morning was a long way off. It was coming regardless. Elena sat in the light of it and did not look away.